Good morning. This slide doesn't seem to be quite sitting right, but I'm sure we'll get the drift of what the text is saying as we go along. Thank you, Dave, for your words and thoughts this morning. I thought, I'm just going to sit here and let you preach, because it ties in nicely with the sermon and the study that's going to come later today. There was a man who had listened to two very powerful sermons from the Psalms. One sermon was from Psalm 51, where he learned that you just can't keep secrets from God. And the second powerful sermon was from Psalm 52, where he learned about the sinfulness of lying and deceit. And so these two sermons together really convicted the guy about what he was doing, which wasn't very great. So he decided to write a letter to the Inland Revenue. The letter said, "I have been unable to sleep, knowing that I have cheated on my income tax. I understand my taxable income and have enclosed a cheque for £150. P.S. If I still can't sleep, I'll send the rest." When it comes to the Psalms, all too often we just read them out without really any explanation behind them, what's going on in the background and things. And when I discovered we were going to be preaching through the Psalms, I, for one, got really excited about it. And thank you for that, Charles. I got excited because I see it as an opportunity to try and bring the words to life a little bit instead of just being words. And that's because the Psalms are a collection of inspired Hebrew poems, prayers and songs that are written by men to God or about God. And if we learn anything from them, they help us to see the expressions from our hearts. We could really talk to God in ways that we could never usually talk to Him, expressed the things that's going on. And so they teach us that God longs to hear from us. And if you're ever struggling to pray to God about what's really going on in your heart, then read the Psalms. Because there's people just pouring their hearts out to God about how they feel. And remember, the Jews knew the Psalms really, really well. They heard them being read out in the synagogue week in and week out. And when anybody read out the first line of any psalm, the Jews would be able to recite the whole psalm in their minds because they've heard it so often. That's why often Jesus, you see him in the New Testament, he'll just quote the first line from a psalm. Because he knows that those who are listening knows the whole of the psalm, and they would understand exactly what he was talking about when he quoted from one of the psalms. And so the psalm we're going to look at today is a psalm written by David, which is usually used in temple worship or tabernacle worship. And it begins in verse 1. He says, "Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live in your holy mountain?" And so here David begins by asking two questions. Who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live in your holy mountain? Now, the sacred tent is a reference to the tabernacle. And the tabernacle represented the presence of God. The holy mountain is Mount Zion. It's Jerusalem, where God's people lived. And that's what those two references are. And so in other words, David is asking the question, what kind of person can live and have fellowship with God? But there's a deeper question being asked here. What's the point of your existence? When I was younger, I used to ask myself all the time, what's the point of life? You're born. You grow up, you get a job, you get a house, you get married, you have kids, you get old, and then you die. Then what's the point? What's the point of me even trying to be a good husband? What's the point of me trying to be even a great father? Why should I try and live a good life? Why should I be nice to people? What difference does it make how I live my life? You see, David is asking the most important question of all, and that is, what's the point of living a life without God? Or we could say the other way around, Why would anyone want to live a life with God continually present in it? Well, ones, the way we live our lives as Christians is either going to have a positive or a negative impact on those around us. They're either going to see God's influence in our life or they're not. I remember when I was at Bible school, we had a teacher who everybody really respected. I mean, the school respected him, the congregation respected him, churches throughout the UK respected him. And he came across as a really godly man, living with a godly family. And I had a great deal of respect for that guy, like many people did. But it wasn't until years later, when I left the school, it came to light that he was actually physically and emotionally abusing his wife and children. I'm going to be telling you something honest here. I don't respect that guy anymore. I don't respect him anymore. You see, we'll never know what a person is really like unless we spend time, good quality time with those people. Because when we spend time with each other, we get to know what's going on inside with each other. We get to know what we're thinking. We soon discover what they really think about other people. We soon discover what they actually believe concerning the Bible. We soon discover if they're practicing one thing and preaching another. So, in other words, if we're claiming that God is with us and God is influencing our lives, then our friends, our families, our work colleagues, our neighbours should see that influence in our lives. And what are some of the kind of godly characteristics, if you want, of people who live with God? What kind of life should we be living to show the world that God really does control our lives? Well, David continues. He says, the one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart. David tells us there are three things here which identify us as having fellowship with God. He says if you want to know if God is having an influence in your life, then you must be blameless, you must be righteous, and you must be truthful. Now remember, blameless doesn't mean sinless. It's two different things. Okay? Remember when Paul was arguing with the legalizers in Philippi? He's arguing with them, and in chapter 3 he says, in my zeal for God I persecuted the church. According to the righteousness stipulated in the law, I was blameless. In other words, he was blameless in the sense that he did everything that he had to do to be right with God. You see, the law of Moses demanded that a person had to offer the appropriate sacrifice to be right with God. In the New Testament, we know that a person has to be baptized and needs to confess those sins to God to be right with God. And notice also that David said, speaking truth from the heart, from a pure heart. You see, when a person is blameless and right with God, righteousness basically means being right with God. So a person who's blameless and right with God, then everything we should say should come from a pure heart. You see, when a person is blameless and right with God, that's the only kind of people who's going to have fellowship with God. It's the only people who's going to have fellowship with God. And the way we live our lives, the way we walk, the way we talk, should show the world that we belong to God. And the only way to achieve that goal of being blameless and right and truthful is by putting into practice what the Hebrew writer tells us to do. When he says, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. The only way to live a life that's worthy of being called in fellowship with God is to put into practice what Paul told the Colossians to do, where he says, since then you've been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated on the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on things below. And so the only way we can walk, talk a blameless, righteous, truthful life is by putting into practice what David says next. He says, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbour, and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honours those who fear the Lord, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change his mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent. Notice David says, if we want to have fellowship with God, then we must be careful how we treat those around us. I don't know if you've noticed this. The focus of the psalm isn't about our attitude towards God. The focus of the psalm is about our attitude towards those around us, the way we treat them. And David says, if anyone wants to have fellowship with God, then we need to treat people with dignity. We need to treat people with respect. You know, it's a shame, but there are people who love nothing more to speak about others, isn't there? And the reason people speak about other people is an effort to make themselves feel good by comparing themselves with somebody else. And people do that, and certainly that happens within the church as well. And one of the obvious signs of people gossiping is when you walk into a room and everything goes silent. Have you had that? Everything goes silent. And then usually the group will split up, or the people will split up and then they'll leave the room. That's an obvious sign. Some other signs are not so obvious. Telephone calls, text messages, emails, all talking about other people. Now you might not be able to stop others from gossiping about you, but gossiping shouldn't even be in the Christian vocabulary. It shouldn't be there. Proverbs 10 says, whoever controls hatred with lying lips and spreads slander is a fool. And we learned last week what a fool is, didn't we, in our study. You see, there's nothing positive about gossiping. All it does is tear people down. It doesn't build them up. All gossip does is harm people. It's a sinful attempt to discredit somebody's values, their actions, or their motives. And David says there are two types of people we like to gossip about: our neighbours and our so-called friends. Those are the two people. Have you ever spoke to somebody in confidence about a really sensitive issue, and the next thing you know, everybody seems to know it? You ever had that? You see, do you know what that does? It breaks friendship. And it breaks trust. Now I don't know about you, but I've only got a handful of people I could talk to about absolutely anything. I think that's sad, but it's a fact. A handful. And the reason I've only got a handful of people is because of Proverbs 11:13, where he says, a gossip betrays a confidence, but a trustworthy person keeps a secret. Do you see the difference? The point is that gossiping is never acceptable in God's eyes. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter who's doing the gossiping. It doesn't matter who's even thinking about gossiping or actually doing it. It's all sinful. And it'll prevent a person from having fellowship with God. Ask yourself this question. Would you want to be a part of a group who call themselves Christians and all they do is slag each other off behind their backs? Would you want to be a part of a group like that? Let me give you some practical advice for when you feel the urge to speak to someone about somebody else? Ask yourself these questions I'm going to put up here in a second. And if you fail to answer these questions, then my advice to you is just to keep quiet. Say nothing. My advice to you is to think first before you say anything. My first question is this. Is what you're about to say about somebody true? You know, so many times people come up with all kinds of wrong conclusions about somebody because they're based upon the wrong assumptions. True? Yeah. Proverbs 18:2 says, "Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." The next question you need to ask yourself, is it helpful? Is this going to help a situation? Solomon says, "Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips." The next question, is it inspiring? Paul says, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building up others according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." The next question, is it necessary? Do you really have to say what you're going to say about somebody? Proverbs again says, "Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongues." And then finally, is it kind? Again, Proverbs 15:4 says, "The soothing tongue is a tree of life, but a perverse tongue crushes the spirit." Loved ones, if we want to have fellowship with God, gossiping should have no place in the Christian life. The Christian shouldn't be in the practice of harming anyone. The Christian shouldn't be in the practice of trying to disgrace anybody else. And so David continues and tells us if people want to have fellowship with God, then they shouldn't find any value in associating with those who are despised, but want to be around God's people. Now please don't misunderstand what David is saying here. It would be a huge mistake to suggest that he's telling us to stay away from anybody who isn't a believer. That would be a huge mistake. What he's saying is that our interaction with others should be limited, especially if their values and beliefs and actions are inconsistent with our Christian lives. It was Mark Twain who once said, "Few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example." I love that. See, David is saying we shouldn't try and follow the example of those who don't follow God. But he's saying the example we should follow are those who follow God's example, and those who follow God's ways. He continues and tells us if we want to have fellowship with God, we must be willing to help those around us without changing their minds. Has anybody ever promised you that they're going to help meet your need, but they fail to do it? Have you ever had that experience? Days, weeks, months go by and still they haven't met your need. I mean, how does that make you feel? It makes you feel that you can't trust that person. It gives the impression that they don't really care about you. It gives the impression that they're unreliable. You see, as Christians, when we promise to take care of somebody's needs, we need to fulfill that promise, no matter how much it hurts. Now you might think, well, how is it going to hurt? Well, it hurts in many ways. It could become very inconvenient for us to fulfill that promise. It might cost us money to fulfill that promise. We might need to change our own personal plans to fulfill that promise. And David said, if you want to have fellowship with God, We mustn't only be concerned about the needs of others, we must meet those needs of others. We can't tell people we're going to help them and then change our minds about it later. Why? Because they'll come to the conclusion that Christians are just as bad as everybody else. They can't be trusted. David goes on and says, anybody who wants to have fellowship with God must be willing to financially help others without adding interest. God says, way back in Exodus 22, if you lend money to one of any of my people among you who's in need, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. In the Old Testament, God makes it very clear that if somebody is in desperate need for some cash, then you've not to treat it like a business deal. You've not to charge any interest in it. Now, I know we don't often very talk about money much here, do we? In a congregation, apart from taking up an offering and things. But ask yourself, what's the point of lending some money to somebody and putting interest on it when you know that they're barely going to be able to pay that money back? What's the point? Imagine somebody comes to you and asks you for a loan because they've come under financial stress. What good does it do if you put them even more financial stress by saying, I'll give you the money, but I want some interest on top of it? Doesn't do any good, does it? It just adds to the stress. Let me ask you a question. How do you get a loan from a bank? You have to prove that you don't need one in the first place. It's true, isn't it? You try and go to a bank and say, listen, I'm broke, I don't have any money, can I have a loan please? And you watch for the reaction. Yeah? It just doesn't happen. They won't give you anything unless you can prove that you actually don't need it in the first place. Now, loved ones, lending people money is biblically acceptable. It really is. Especially within God's people. Now, I'm not encouraging Christians to start borrowing money from each other, okay? I'm not promoting that. But what I am saying is that there are times when everybody, all Christians, come under financial stress. A person could lose their job and can't afford to pay their electricity bills. A sudden death in the family comes along and all of a sudden they've got these funeral bills that they can't pay. And I understand that it could be embarrassing asking people for money. I understand it's easy to ask your physical family, but you must never forget you've got a spiritual family as well. You've got a spiritual family who should always be willing to help. The church should always be willing to help each other out without adding any extra pressure of interest repayments. And so anybody who wants to have fellowship with God must be willing to help others, especially financially, without looking to gain anything back for themselves. And David continues, and he says, anybody who wants to have fellowship with God mustn't take bribes or give false testimony against somebody else. Now, a bribe is all about perverting justice by trying to win someone's favour over somebody else. Again, way back in Exodus, God says, do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Here's something to think about. Bribery isn't always talking about money passing from one hand to the other in a shady deal. Bribery comes in all shapes and forms. And if you've been around long enough, I'm pretty sure you'll know what I'm talking about. Let me give you an example. I heard a story about a man who wanted to become a preacher of a church. Problem was, there was already a preacher in that church. The leadership didn't like the preacher because he was getting a bit too popular. And so they subtly suggested to this new Christian man that he could become the preacher if they help him get rid of this current preacher. They didn't say it in those exact words, but it was very subtly said the way it was suggested. And so after a few months, all kinds of accusations were being made until the preacher finally moved on. The preacher didn't retaliate to any accusations. He didn't want anything to do with it. He just let them get on with it. A few months after moving on, he met up with that young man. And the preacher says to him, "Listen, I know this is going to hurt, but you are being used." And he totally denied it. 1 year later, he called the preacher up. And he says, "You know what? You were right." Needless to say, he left that church and joined somewhere else. See, the leadership went all out to make him feel special. Went all out to make him feel important, to the point where he was being spiritually bribed without even knowing it. He ended up blinded to the truth, not only about the leadership, but about that preacher as well. And so anybody who wants to have fellowship with God must be careful not to accept bribes in any shape or form it comes in order to discredit the innocent. And so, loved ones, if we claim we've got fellowship with God, then we need to show the world that we do indeed have that fellowship with God in the way that we treat those who are around us. And when I was putting this together, I thought to myself, is all this worth it? Is all this trying to be right, to have fellowship with God? Is it beneficial for us? Is it really worth the effort? Well, David finishes and says, "Whoever does these things will never be shaken." See, in other words, not only do we have fellowship with God, but God promises to hold us up. I hope we understand this. This world we're living in wants to drag us down. This world we're living in wants to accuse us of all kinds of things, and it wants to bring us to our knees. But God said, if you're in fellowship with me and you're treating those around you with dignity and respect, He says, let me tell you something, I'm going to hold you up. I don't care what the world thinks, God says. I'm going to hold you up. Because it's God who gives us the strength to stay on our feet. It's God who holds us up when we haven't got the strength to keep standing up. Isaiah says, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. And so the question I want to leave you with is this. Do we really have fellowship with God? Because we can't claim to have that fellowship with Him if all we do is gossip about others around us. We can't claim we've got fellowship with God if all we want to do is spend more time with those who don't fear God than we do with those who do fear God. We can't claim to have fellowship with God if we promise to help somebody out in their time of need and then we just neglect that promise. We can't claim we've got fellowship with God if we're not willing to help others out financially without asking for anything in return. We can't claim to have fellowship with God if we bribe others or allow ourselves to be bribed in an effort to discredit the innocent. Let me tell you a truth that you already know. The world doesn't judge our Christianity on our worship attendance, loved ones. The world judges our Christianity in the way we treat and act towards those around us. Now, Psalm that we've just read is found in the Old Testament. Let me sum up in the New Testament with one verse what David has been saying. He says this: if we claim to have fellowship with Him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. God bless.